From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Inside Politics.
Hello, everyone. I'm News Channel 5's political analyst, Pat Nolan. Welcome to Inside Politics. For the last several weeks, and especially this week, the world has been on edge over a possible invasion of the Ukraine by Russia. The United States and its NATO allies have been warning Russian President Vladimir Putin that his country faces unprecedented and severe sanctions if the invasion occurs. This week, every day, if not every few hours, signals have emerged that perhaps the largest military action in Europe since World War II is imminent. But then came word of continued diplomatic talks and that some Russian troops are being withdrawn as war games along the Ukraine border are concluding. But the U.S. and NATO say that Russia is actually adding 7,000 more troops in the last few days to a potential invasion force. When we need insight and wisdom in the area of foreign affairs, we always turn to Vanderbilt political science professor of history and political science is Dr. Thomas Schwartz. Dr. Schwartz is our guest on Inside Politics this week. Dr. Schwartz, welcome to the program. We always appreciate you coming on with us.
Well, thank you very much, Pat, for having me on the program.
Let me say first that we're having this conversation midday Friday. The invasion has not started to occur. Things could be different by the time this program airs. We hope not, but could be, and over the weekend as the program continues to air. Dr. Schwartz, all these conflicting signals, are we really very imminently close to war? Is there still a chance there could be a diplomatic solution to this?
There is a chance. There's always a chance until the fighting actually begins. But certainly all the signals, or the vast majority of the signals, seem to indicate some type of military action will take place. The scale and size of it are still unclear, but it does seem like something's going to happen.
All these things are going on this week about did troops go in, did troops get pulled out, diplomatic talks from NATO people, and the U.S. is continuing to have diplomatic talks to groups around the world. Everybody knows what the other side has. Why does Putin want to try to act like he's been pulling troops out when he really is not?
That may be for domestic consumption. It might be that basically to tell his own people that he's been very reasonable, that he's pulled back troops, but that some event, this is the so-called false flag idea, some event forced him to reverse policy. So he may be designing this approach to war with the Russian public in mind, so to make sure that they recognize that he has been cautious and careful and only ended up responding to NATO aggression, as he put it.
It appears that Russia's core issue is that Putin really doesn't want Ukraine to exist and hasn't since it pulled away from the Soviet Union after the Soviet Union collapsed back about 20 years ago. There's also an issue that Putin doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO while they still exist. The U.S. and NATO says that's not a negotiable item, and it's up to Ukraine to decide what they want to do in their future. How do you work around those two core issues to find any kind of settlement?
Well, certainly if Putin does not believe in an independent Ukraine, there's no real compromise there. On the other hand, if he believes that Ukraine, or if he is willing to accept independent Ukraine, it is certainly possible to provide him assurances that Ukraine is not going to be admitted into NATO anytime soon. And I think clearly he knows that. There is this argument that somehow he believes that this would be betrayed, but NATO is in no hurry at all to take Ukraine in. And so therefore, I think this may be, of course, part of the propaganda more than a serious effort at settlement.
There's been talk that Russia might be satisfied with just taking over a little bit more of the Ukraine, much like it annexed Crimea a couple of years ago. But given how strong and resolute the president so far has been and NATO has been, is that a workable solution? Can they figure out something that also starts to sound like a little bit like peace in our time in Czechoslovakia back right before the Second World War started?
Yes, and the president, originally made a gaffe about it depended on what type of incursion Putin made, so that the idea that perhaps if he only seized a certain limited amount of territory, the reaction in the West would be more limited. And certainly, I think one possibility is that Putin will not do a full-scale invasion and will only extend the rule of the separatist areas, with the idea that countries like Germany that are more willing to compromise with Russia would accept that the more limited nature of Putin's attack means that the Western sanctions or the Western response should not be as severe. So he might try and do a more limited attack in order to divide the West.
I notice in this particular situation, the U.S. seems to be using more of its intelligence and releasing it to the public much more quickly than I've ever seen them do in the past. Is this to sort of counterbalance the Russians? Because they've been very good at being able to spread false information, and particularly to get that out and sort of put the U.S. back on its heels the whole time. But it seems to me the U.S. is trying to use more of those things in order to expose the fact that a false flag is a way that Russia may decide to go ahead and begin to start this war.
Yes, a friend of mine recently suggested to me that this was part of a psychological tactic connected to the fact that the West doesn't really have a lot of tools to stop Putin. So one of the real tools it has is to release intelligence that clearly shows Russian violations, Russian provocations, and Russian aggression. And so the willingness in that sense to compromise in some ways our intelligence assets, because we are basically showing the Russians what we can do, what we know about their calculations, is designed as something to make up for the overall weakness of being able to stop Russian aggression.
Beyond the false flag, there's also some concerns as tensions sort of continue to rise that we've had our planes buzzed by the Russians in the Mediterranean Sea. There have been some other things that make you wonder if this might wind up starting because somebody miscalculated, some junior officer somewhere, some pilot. Is that a concern as we go? Because there's a lot of things going on, a lot of moving parts, troops being deployed to Europe, the Russians bringing up more, even putting apparently a field hospital pretty close to the border, thinking again that's a sign that something may happen.
Yes, I think, whenever you have the prospect of military action, obviously the fear of escalation, the fear that this could get out of hand is going to be there. There's no question about that. And I think in some ways we have to be aware of this. I don't think it's likely to escalate. I don't think Putin wants some sort of broader war or a challenging to the United States. Remember, the United States is not in this war. The United States has very explicitly said Ukraine is not a NATO ally. So in effect, the United States, what we're watching is whether Putin undertakes military action that we have basically said we're not going to be involved in.
A late development this week, the Russians kicked out the number 2 person in our diplomatic corps in Moscow. Is that just a tit for tat? What's that all about?
It's usually a tit for tat. It may be just a way to show the displeasure with the United States. They may have other motives in mind between what he may have been involved in terms of contacts within Russia. But it's usually, those types of disputes are usually tit for tat.
Dr. Thomas Schwartz of Vanderbilt University is our guest. We're talking about the situation going on between Russia and Ukraine. What's going to happen there? We may find out in the next few days. Back to continue our conversation after this break.